November 29, 1935. Lisbon, Ward 3. São Luís Hospital. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the sound of nurses' footsteps echoing down the corridor. In the bed lay a man, 47 years old, though his body looked closer to 60, wasted, hollowed out, cirrhosis of the liver. His abdomen was swollen with fluid. His skin had turned a sickly yellow. Fever had been burning through him for 2 days. His name was Fernando Pessoa, a commercial correspondent in Lisbon's Baixa district. For 28 years, he had worked at 21 different companies, writing business letters in English and French. Every morning at 9, he went to the office. Every evening, he sat in cafes drinking aguardente, a harsh Portuguese brandy. Every night, he returned alone to his room. Outside the window, Lisbon's church bells rang. He didn't count them. That evening, Pessoa asked the nurse for something, pencil and paper. The nurse shook her head. The patient needed rest, but Pessoa asked again. His voice was low, firm. Please? She brought him what he asked for. He sat up against the pillow, his hand trembling, and began to write. The letters formed on the page. A sentence completed. He set the pencil down. I know not what tomorrow will bring. English. A Portuguese man, in a Portuguese hospital in the Portuguese capital, facing death, wrote his final sentence in English. Why? The next evening, November 30th, 1935, around 8 p.m., Fernando Pessoa stopped breathing. Cause of death: cirrhosis. A lifetime of drinking had destroyed his liver. He was 47 years old. On December 2nd, his funeral was held at Prazeres Cemetery. Not many attended, a few writers, some acquaintances from the cafes, family members. The coffin was lowered into the ground. Earth fell upon it. People scattered. A young doctor named Miguel Torga, who would himself become a major writer, wrote in his journal that night, Fernando Pessoa is dead. I wept for the death of the greatest poet of our time, whom Portugal watched pass by in his coffin on his way to immortality, without even asking who he was. At 16, Rua Coelho da Roca, the small apartment where Pessoa had spent his final 15 years, his belongings remained: a wardrobe, a desk, a chair, and one large wooden trunk with a domed lid. When his family opened that trunk, they fell silent. Paper, an immense amount of paper, notebook pages, backs of envelopes, cafe napkins, margins of advertising flyers, backs of business cards, edges of comic books, handwritten manuscripts, typed manuscripts, ink-stained pages, pencil-scratched pages, poems, prose, plays, philosophical essays, political commentary, letters, astrological charts, translations, and countless fragments. Later, they counted them, exactly 25,574 pages, but what mystified them more than the quantity were the signatures. Some pages bore the name Fernando Pessoa, but most were signed with different names: Alberto Caeiro, Ricardo Reis, Álvaro de Campos, Bernardo Soares, Alexander Search, Antonio Mora, Baron of Dive, Maria Jose, and dozens of other names. This wasn't a pen names situation. Each name had a birthdate, physical characteristics, personality traits, philosophical beliefs, even astrological charts, cast by Pessoa the amateur astrologer. One name wrote nature poetry, another wrote classical odes, another wrote futurist manifestos. They had different handwriting styles, different political views, and even wrote criticizing each other. Pessoa wasn't one person, he was a galaxy, 70 or more stars shining inside a single body, each with its own light, each with its own voice, and all of them breathing quietly, inside a trunk in a small room in Lisbon. So why did he write his last words in English? I know not what tomorrow will bring. The answer lies in where he first learned English, where he first became someone other than himself. We have to go back to 1896. To a 7-year-old boy boarding a ship, destination Africa, June 13, 1888. Lisbon's elegant, Chiado district, for Largo de São Carlos, a child was born in a building directly facing the opera house. Wide windows, high ceilings. When the baby arrived, carriage wheels clattered outside, water splashed from the fountain in the square, and in the evenings, music from the opera house, drifted into the living room. His father, Joaquim de Sebra Pessoa, was a music critic. He wrote for newspapers, reviewed operas, was known in Lisbon's cultural circles. His mother, Maria Madalena, came from the Azores. Quiet, she would hold her son and gaze out at the opera house across the street. The baby's name was Fernando. He grew up in the comfort of a middle-class Lisbon household, drank milk, took his first steps, learned to speak, fell asleep to the sound of pages turning in his father's study. Then, on July 13, 1893, everything shattered. His father died. Tuberculosis. In Lisbon at that time, tuberculosis was a disease that consumed people slowly but certainly. The coughing started, fever followed, weight dropped. Days came when he couldn't leave his bed, and one day, his breathing stopped. Fernando was 5 years old. After the funeral, the house changed. His father's study stayed locked. The music from the opera house no longer sounded joyful. His mother wore black mourning clothes and wept quietly. 5-year-old Fernando heard that weeping, didn't understand it, was frightened by it. 7 months later, in January 1894, a second death arrived. His baby brother Jorge died, 1 year old. The records don't specify what illness, only that a small coffin left the house. His mother's weeping deepened, and 6-year-old Fernando was now alone. No father, no brother. The elegant building across from the opera house now felt like an empty stage. His mother rarely left her room. His grandmother took care of Fernando. The boy sat by the window watching people pass through the square. Everyone was going somewhere. Everyone had a destination. But in this house, there was nowhere to go. And right then, 6-year-old Fernando created something. Chevalier de Paz, a French name. It meant Knight of Peace. Fernando began writing letters to this knight. He took out paper, picked up a pencil. In a 6-year-old's clumsy handwriting, he wrote sentence after sentence. The Chevalier de Paz didn't actually exist, but to Fernando, he did exist. He was brave, strong, immortal. He went on adventures, fought enemies, won victories. He received letters, replied, conversed with Fernando. Most lonely children create imaginary friends, someone to play with, someone to talk to, someone to fill their solitude. But Fernando didn't create an imaginary friend. He created an imaginary writer. The Chevalier de Paz wasn't simply Fernando's playmate. He was a being with his own voice. He wrote letters. Fernando received them. Two people exchanged conversation on paper. Did the 6-year-old boy already know that he alone couldn't bear this world, that he couldn't endure it by himself, that he needed to become someone else? Why? An imaginary writer, instead of an imaginary friend. A friend stays with you, but a writer creates worlds. A friend comforts you, but a writer rewrites reality. What 6-year-old Fernando needed wasn't comfort, it was transformation. The ability to change this sad house, this heavy reality with its dead father and dead brother, into something else. So he wrote letters, replied under the name Chevalier de Paz, and on paper, he began living in a world that wasn't Lisbon, but outside the house. Reality was crumbling further. His grandmother was institutionalized in a mental asylum. Years later, Pessoa would write, "One of my mental complications, horrible beyond words, is a fear of insanity, which itself is insanity." Then in December 1895, his mother remarried, by proxy, to João Miguel Rosa, a Portuguese consul in Durban, South Africa, a place Fernando had never seen, a man he'd never met. On January 20, 1896, 7-year-old Fernando boarded a ship, destination Africa. He was leaving the city where he was born, heading to a place from which he would never truly return, and there, Fernando Pessoa learned how to become someone other than Fernando Pessoa. In British-governed Natal, Pessoa received the education that would define everything. He attended Irish Catholic Grammar School, then Durban High School. He became so fluent in English that he would write primarily in that language until age 20. A classmate later recalled, he was regarded as a brilliant, clever boy, in spite of the fact that he had not spoken English in his early years. He had learned it so rapidly and so well that he had a splendid style in that language. In November 1903, competing against 899 candidates. The 15-year-old Portuguese boy won the Queen Victoria Memorial Prize for the Best English Essay, a feat that astounded his British peers. He devoured Shakespeare, Milton, Keats, and crucially, Edgar Allan Poe and Walt Whitman. Pessoa himself would later declare this English education a factor of supreme importance in my life, and whatever my fate be, indubitably shaping it. Yet, even amid academic triumph, the pattern held. He took no part in athletic sports of any kind, and I think his spare time was spent on reading. We generally considered that he worked far too much, always pale, thin, solitary, already creating English language heteronyms like Alexander Search. But here's what matters for us. 100 years later, Pessoa learned to think in a language that wasn't his mother tongue. He learned to write in a voice that wasn't his own. He learned, at 7 years old, that you could board a ship, cross an ocean, and become someone completely different. He learned that identity wasn't fixed, it was fluid, changeable, a choice. Before Instagram, before LinkedIn personas, before we learned to perform different selves on different platforms, Pessoa was doing it, in 1896. At age 7, the stranger in a strange land becomes a stranger to himself, and that strangeness becomes his art form. At 17, Pessoa could have won scholarships to British universities, but he didn't meet residency requirements. In August 1905 he sailed alone through the Suez Canal back to Lisbon. His family stayed in South Africa. He never lived with them again. He enrolled at the University of Lisbon to study diplomacy, dropped out after 8 months without sitting for exams, never returned to formal education. Instead, he educated himself at the National Library while working as a commercial correspondent, drafting business letters in English and French for Portuguese firms. For the next 28 years, until his death, he would work at 21 different companies in Lisbon's downtown Baixa district, sometimes at 2 or 3 simultaneously. The gap between Pessoa's mundane employment and his literary genius became the central tension of his existence. Picture this: morning, 9 a.m., Baixa district, Lisbon. Hundreds of trading companies packed into buildings, 2nd floor, 3rd floor, 4th floor, wooden staircases, narrow corridors, glass doors. Beyond the glass, desks. Pessoa's desk was by the window, stacks of letters piled on top, an inkwell, a fountain pen in its holder. He sat down, picked up a letter, began reading. Manchester, 15th October 1910. Dear Sirs, we regret to inform you that a letter from a British client, a complaint about shipping delays, demands for compensation. The tone was formal, but displeasure bled through. Pessoa wrote a summary in Portuguese, reported to his supervisor, received instructions, apologized politely, explained the delay, offer compensation. Pessoa pulled out fresh paper. Dear Sirs, we have received your letter of 15th October with sincere regret. The sentences flowed, fluent, precise, perfect business English. He apologized without groveling, explained without making excuses, offered compensation without overdoing it. 3 paragraphs, appropriate length, polite closing. We remain, dear sirs, your obedient servants. He signed it. The company name, the name Fernando Pessoa, appeared nowhere. 20-30 letters per day, sometimes more. Order confirmations, quote requests, quality inquiries, claim processing, payment reminders, contract revisions, write in English, write in French, translate, type, review, seal. He had colleagues. Sebastião at the next desk handled accounting, liked numbers, drank a glass of wine at lunch. Manuel across handled Portuguese clients, loud voice, told jokes frequently. Gloria the typist was 19, typed quickly, gazed out the window during breaks. They tried to talk to Pessoa. Mr. Pessoa, what do you do on weekends? I read. What do you read? Books. What kind of books? Various kinds. The conversation ended there. Pessoa wasn't rude, but wasn't friendly, didn't refuse but didn't invite. He existed but didn't participate. His colleagues soon left him alone. He wrote his letters. The office filled with the sound of typewriters and turning pages. Lunch break at noon. Pessoa left the office, entered a small nearby restaurant, sat in a corner, His order was always similar: fish, potatoes, bread, water. He ate quickly, didn't savor the taste. It was an act of filling his stomach, not of enjoyment. After eating, he went to a café, Café Martinho da Arcada, one of Lisbon's oldest cafés, opened in 1782. Near Commercio Square, high ceilings, marble tables lined up, writers gathered, journalists argued, politicians held secret meetings. Pessoa always sat in the same spot, a corner table by the window. The waiter approached. Pessoa nodded. The order was known without speaking: a small espresso called bica, and a glass of aguardente. Aguardente was Portuguese brandy, strong, burned the throat, set fire to the stomach. Pessoa drank slowly, smoked, gazed out the window. People passing through the square, merchants, sailors, bureaucrats, shishiners, begging old men, women selling flowers, everyone going somewhere, everyone doing something, everyone living life. Pessoa watched them, observed, remembered. Sometimes he took out a notebook, pocket-sized, pencil attached, wrote a few lines, sentences, ideas, observations, images, not completed writing but seeds, fragments of something to write later, memos for the night. 30 minutes passed. Pessoa stood, paid, returned to the office. Afternoon work began, continued writing letters. The sun tilted. 6 p.m. Left work. For 28 years, Pessoa worked at 21 different companies. Companies changed, but work stayed the same. Offices differed, but desks were similar. Colleagues rotated, but conversations were identical. He was a competent employee, a reliable translator, a replaceable laborer. His salary was small. After paying room rent, meal costs, and buying books, almost nothing remained. No savings, no property. All he owned were clothes, books, and manuscripts. He came from middle-class origins, but was poor. He was educated, but lower class. He was a genius but unknown. At night, he returned to his room. From 1905 to 1920, Pessoa lived in 15 different rented rooms around Lisbon. In 1920, after his stepfather's death, his mother returned from South Africa, and he leased an apartment at Rua Coelho da Roca, 16. He would live there for his final 15 years. The room was small: one bed, one desk, one wardrobe, one large trunk. He usually wrote standing up at a tall chest of drawers, chain smoking constantly. He wrote on everything: notebook paper, envelope backs, cafe napkins, advertising flyer margins, comic strip edges, calling cards. His first biographer recalled, "I was struck by how his feet hardly seemed to touch the ground, as if he were suspended by a wire hooked to an invisible nail." Night after night, alone, writing, but not as Fernando Pessoa, as someone else, as many others, under different names, in different voices, with different philosophies. Why didn't he publish? Fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of mockery. Fear of being ignored. Or was it perfectionism? Did he think it wasn't good enough yet? Needed more polishing? Wasn't complete? Or did he already know that his real readers hadn't been born yet? That his writing wasn't for 1906 Lisbon, but for someone 50 years later, 100 years later? At 17, he returned to Lisbon, quit university after 8 months, moved between boarding houses. During the day, wrote English letters. At night, wrote poetry under other names. Nobody noticed. This was Fernando Pessoa's 20s, a failed student, an insignificant office worker, an unknown poet. Outwardly, he was nothing, but inside, something was preparing. Until March 8, 1914. Until that day, 9 a.m., March 8, 1914. Lisbon's Baixa district. Wind from the Tagus River swept through narrow streets. Wet stone from last night's rain still glistened. Shopkeepers began rolling up their shutters one by one. Tram 28 climbed the hill. A newspaper boy shouted from a corner. Footsteps of commuters echoed on the cobblestones. Fernando Pessoa was among that crowd. Black suit, white shirt, necktie, slightly shorter than average height, thin frame, pale face. Behind his glasses, his eyes were deep, but nobody looked into them. His lips were thin, but he rarely spoke. His footsteps were quiet, but his destination was clear. The office. That day passed like any other. Letters, translation, typing, lunch at the small restaurant, 30 minutes at Café Martinho da Arcada, Aguardent, one cigarette, back to work. 6 p.m. He left. But something was different. As he walked through the Bexa streets toward his room, something was stirring inside him. Not a thought, not an idea, something deeper, a pressure, a fullness, like water behind a dam that was about to break. He walked faster, up the stairs, unlocked the door, entered his room, didn't take off his coat, didn't turn on all the lights, went straight to the tall chest of drawers where he always wrote standing up, pulled out paper, grabbed his fountain pen, and then it happened. A name appeared, not spoken aloud, not heard with ears. It rose from within, not someone speaking it, but simply knowing it, without needing to ask, with absolute certainty. Alberto Caeiro. That was the person who would write this poem. The fountain pen began to move. I am the keeper of sheep who does not think. The sheep are my thoughts, and all my thoughts are sensations. I think with my eyes and ears. 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, 4 lines. It didn't stop. The first poem finished, and a second began. The second finished, and a third began. He couldn't stop. Pessoa's hand moved, but he wasn't writing. The pen was his, but the handwriting was someone else's. The voice came from his mouth, but the words belonged to another being. Ecstasy, creative ecstasy. The moment when the self disappears, and something else enters. The moment when control is lost, and you surrender to the flow. The moment when you're not writing but receiving. Pessoa was no longer Pessoa, he was Caeiro, and through Caeiro flowed something else. The paper filled, 1 sheet, 2 sheets, 3 sheets, 1 poem, 2, 5, 10. The sun set, shadows lengthened, the room began to darken. Pessoa lit a lamp, kept writing, didn't stop. Who was Alberto Caeiro? As Pessoa wrote, he came to know, not by seeing but by feeling, not by imagining, but by remembering, not by creating, but by discovering. Caeiro was born in 1889 in Lisbon, but spent almost his entire life in the countryside of Ribatejo. Only finished elementary school, no higher education, barely read books, average height, slightly stooped shoulders, blonde hair, blue eyes, face tanned by the sun. He would die in 1915 of tuberculosis at age 26. He was a philosopher, but rejected philosophy, a poet but dismissed literature, a sage but claimed to know nothing. His only truth was sensation, his only knowledge was seeing, his only wisdom was not thinking. To think is to have sore eyes, to think is to not hear, to think is to have a heartache. For Caeiro, the world was simple. A flower was just a flower, a tree was just a tree, a river was just a river. No meaning needed, no symbolism, no metaphor. Existing was enough, seeing was complete, feeling was truth, and he was Pessoa's master. Wait, master? Why a master? Why would 25-year-old Pessoa create someone older than himself, born before him, destined to die before him? Why not a disciple? Why not a follower? Why not a student? Years later, Pessoa would write, "The master appeared within me, the master within." Pessoa found someone greater than himself within himself, someone who could teach him, a voice he could follow, wisdom he could receive. Why? Because Pessoa couldn't trust himself. Fernando Pessoa was a failure, dropped out of university, worked as a commercial correspondent, barely making ends meet, published almost nothing, received no recognition. Fernando Pessoa's voice was too small, too anxious, too filled with doubt. But Alberto Caeiro was different. Caeiro was certain, didn't doubt, didn't hesitate, was completely himself. Caeiro was the person Pessoa could never be, the person Pessoa wanted to be, the person Pessoa needed. So he was the master. We take as our master someone better than ourselves, someone who knows what we don't know, someone who can do what we can't do, someone who is what we cannot be. Pessoa couldn't find such a master outside, not in Lisbon, not anywhere in the world. So he created one inside. Night deepened, Lisbon slept, streets emptied, only stars shone outside his window. In Pessoa's room, the lamp stayed lit, smoke rose, the fountain pen kept moving. 20 poems, 25, 30, all at once. without stopping, without revision. Pessoa would later write, "I began by writing a title, The Keeper of Sheep, and what followed was the appearance in me of someone I immediately named Alberto Caeiro. Forgive the absurdity of the phrase my master appeared in me, that was my immediate sensation, so much so that, as soon as those 30-some poems were written, I immediately grabbed more paper and wrote, also all at once, the 6 poems that constitute A Bleak Rain, by Fernando Pessoa. Immediately and totally, it was the return of Fernando Pessoa, Alberto Caeiro, to Fernando Pessoa himself, or better, it was the reaction of Fernando Pessoa against his non-existence as Alberto Caeiro, the triumphal day. What triumph was this? Not Caeiro's triumph, Pessoa's triumph. Pessoa had exceeded his own limits, his own doubts, his own failures. By creating Caeiro, Pessoa proved something, that something greater than himself existed within him, that a voice stronger than his own existed, that a complete existence was possible. That night, Pessoa understood. One person wasn't enough. Fernando Pessoa as a single identity couldn't express all the truths of the world, so he needed to be many, not just Caeiro, but more people, more voices, more beings, and they were coming. Following Caeiro, others would appear. Caeiro's disciples, Caeiro's critics, people to argue with Caeiro. A voice that began with one person would become a chorus. A universe that started with one being would become a galaxy. And March 8, 1914 was the day that universe exploded. Dawn came. Pessoa finished the last poem, set down his fountain pen, looked at the pile of papers. 32 poems, written in one night. 32 poems by Alberto Caeiro. He was exhausted, his hand trembled, his eyes ached, his body was heavy, but he was happy. No, happy wasn't the right word. He was fulfilled, complete, finished. A bird sang outside the window. Lisbon's dawn was breaking. The eastern sky changed from gray to pink. The sound of the first carriage came from the street. The smell of baking bread drifted through the window crack. Pessoa lay down on his bed, still wearing his clothes, without covering himself, and fell asleep, deeply, peacefully, asleep with his master present. But Caeiro wasn't alone. That same night, or in the nights that immediately followed, 2 others appeared. Ricardo Reis, a classicist, a doctor, born in Porto in 1887. Educated by Jesuits, short, sturdy build, black hair, wore glasses, reserved temperament, royalist in politics, pagan in religion. He wrote odes, in the style of Horace, perfect meter, classical restraint. His philosophy was Epicurean, seize the day, accept fate, enjoy what the gods permit. Wise is he who accepts what fate gives him, and finds joy in moderation. Caeiro's disciple, but more disciplined than his master, more structured, more concerned with form. Álvaro de Campos, born in Tavera in 1890. Naval engineer, studied in Glasgow, tall, thin, between clean-shaven and mustached, depending on period, energetic temperament, sometimes depressed, sometimes manic. He wrote manifestos, futurist declarations, long, chaotic poems celebrating machines, speed, violence, and sensation. Then later, poems of exhaustion, boredom, and metaphysical emptiness. I feel like I'll vomit my soul. All my life weighs on me. I want to sleep away consciousness, thought, life. Also Caeiro's disciple, but rebelled against his master, too emotional, too modern, too excessive. And one more, Bernardo Soares, a semi-heteronym, as Pessoa called him, an assistant bookkeeper at a textile firm on Duradores Street in Baixa, kept ledgers, added numbers, organized invoices. Just like Pessoa worked as a commercial correspondent, Soares worked as an accountant. Pessoa wrote English letters. Soares calculated Portuguese currency. Soares lived alone, in a boarding house, 4th floor, narrow window, minimal furniture. Just like Pessoa, almost identical. So why did Pessoa need him? Because Soares could say what Pessoa couldn't say. Soares could feel what Pessoa had to hide. Soares could admit what Pessoa had to deny during working hours. Soares wrote the Book of Disquiet, fragments, meditations, observations, Confessions of a man who dreams while doing ledger entries, a man who travels the world while sitting at his desk, a man who lives infinite lives while appearing to live none. I am the gap between what I'd like to be and what others have made me. That day passed like any other. Letters, translation, typing, lunch at the small restaurant, 30 minutes at Café Martinho da Arcada, Aguardent, one cigarette, back to work. 6 p.m. He left. But something was different as he walked through the Baxa streets toward his room. Something was stirring inside him, not a thought, not an idea, something deeper, a pressure, a fullness, like water behind a dam that was about to break. He walked faster, up the stairs, unlocked the door, entered his room, didn't take off his coat, didn't turn on all the lights, went straight to the tall chest of drawers where he always wrote standing up, pulled out paper, grabbed his fountain pen. And then it happened. A name appeared, not spoken aloud, not heard with ears. It rose from within, not someone speaking it, but simply knowing it, without needing to ask, with absolute certainty. Alberto Caeiro. That was the person who would write this poem. The fountain pen began to move. I am the keeper of sheep who does not think. The sheep are my thoughts, and all my thoughts are sensations. I think with my eyes and ears. 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines. 4 lines. It didn't stop. The first poem finished, and a second began. The second finished, and a third began. He couldn't stop. Pessoa's hand moved, but he wasn't writing. The pen was his, but the handwriting was someone else's. The voice came from his mouth, but the words belonged to another being. Ecstasy, creative ecstasy. The moment when the self disappears, and something else enters. The moment when control is lost, and you surrender to the flow. The moment when you're not writing but receiving. Pessoa was no longer Pessoa, he was Caeiro, and through Caeiro flowed something else. The paper filled, 1 sheet, 2 sheets, 3 sheets, 1 poem, 2, 5, 10. The sun set, shadows lengthened, the room began to darken. Pessoa lit a lamp, kept writing, didn't stop. Who was Alberto Caeiro? As Pessoa wrote, he came to know, not by seeing but by feeling, not by imagining, but by remembering, not by creating, but by discovering. Caeiro was born in 1889 in Lisbon, but spent almost his entire life in the countryside of Ribatejo. Only finished elementary school, no higher education, barely read books, average height, slightly stooped shoulders, blonde hair, blue eyes, face tanned by the sun. He would die in 1915 of tuberculosis at age 26. He was a philosopher, but rejected philosophy, a poet but dismissed literature, a sage but claimed to know nothing. His only truth was sensation, his only knowledge was seeing, his only wisdom was not thinking. To think is to have sore eyes, to think is to not hear. 11 years old, Pessoa's Heteronyms, Caeiro, Reis, Campos, Soares. They were fully alive now, writing, arguing, existing, and then Pessoa met someone real. Her name was Ofelia Queiroz, 19 years old, secretary at the commercial office of Felix, Valadas and Freitas, where 31-year-old Pessoa was working. It happened during a power outage. The office went dark. Pessoa lit an oil lamp, walked to her desk, and recited Shakespeare, Hamlet to Ophelia. Oh dear Ophelia, I love you to the extreme. Then, in Ophelia's own words, he kissed me passionately, like crazy. For the first time in his life, Fernando Pessoa was trying to be just one person, not 70 people, not Caeiro or Reis or Campos, just Fernando, a 31-year-old man who wanted to love a 19-year-old woman. They wrote love letters, took walks through Lisbon. He called her Little Wasp, she called him Nininho. They talked about the future, maybe marriage, maybe a life together. But then something strange happened. Ofelia received a letter, not from Fernando Pessoa, from Álvaro de Campos. Campos explained that his friend Fernando couldn't communicate with her that day. Campos apologized on Fernando's behalf, wrote in his own voice, signed his own name. At first, Ofelia thought it was a game, charming, even, so she wrote back, played along. But Campos replied again, this time jealously, possessively, as if he, not Pessoa, had a claim on her attention. Who was writing to her? Fernando or Campos? the man or the heteronym, the lover or the literary creation. Even Pessoa couldn't separate them anymore. The relationship lasted about a year. Then in 1920, Pessoa ended it, abruptly, with a brief letter. 9 years of silence followed. In 1929, they reconnected, tried again, exchanged letters, met a few times, but it didn't work. On January 11, 1930, Pessoa sent his final letter. It was short, dry, definitive. Little Wasp, this is my last letter. I will not see you again. I didn't want to make this decision, but my destiny belongs to another law, whose existence you're not even aware of, and I am evermore the slave of masters who do not relent and do not forgive. What did he mean? Another law? Other masters? Who were they? Caeiro? Reis? Campos? The 70 heteronyms? Or literature itself? Pessoa chose between love and writing, between Ophelia and the heteronyms, between an ordinary life and a creative life, and he let Ophelia go. Ophelia didn't reply. There was nothing to say. She couldn't understand, couldn't accept, could only feel hurt. They never met again. When Pessoa died in 1935, Ophelia was 35 years old, still unmarried. She would never marry until her death in 1991 at age 91. She kept Pessoa's letters, preserved the memory. In interviews, she still called him Nininho. Pessoa's biographer Richard Zenith concluded, it is probable, though not provable, that he died a virgin, 31 when he first loved, 42 when he ended his last love, 10 years between, and 5 years after. Pessoa never loved another woman, never kissed anyone else, never embraced anyone else. Why? Fear. Fear of intimacy, fear of getting close to another person, fear of giving himself, fear of depending on someone. Pessoa feared losing control. Love demanded surrender. It was unpredictable, variable, uncontrollable. Emotions rose. Desire burned. Reason crumbled. Pessoa couldn't endure it. He needed to control everything, his emotions, his thoughts, his existence. That's why he created 70 heteronyms, to turn his chaotic interior into an ordered galaxy, to transform madness into system, to convert chaos into art. But love couldn't be controlled, so he gave it up. Or maybe another reason, maybe Pessoa couldn't be shared. How could a man living with 70 heteronyms share his life with one person? In an interior, where Caeiro, Reis, Campos, Soares, and 66 others lived, was there space for Ophelia? There wasn't. Pessoa's interior was already full, too many voices, too many beings, too many worlds living inside him. There was no room for Ophelia, no space for ordinary love, no leisure for simple happiness, so he sent her away. My destiny belongs to another law. That law was the law of creation, the law of art, the law of multiplicity, the law of creating 70 people perfectly, instead of loving one person deeply. But here's the irony, just as Pessoa sent Campos to speak when he couldn't express love, don't you do the same? Instead of texting I love you directly, you send a heart emoji. Instead of expressing feelings directly, you share a song lyric. Instead of approaching directly, you post something suggestive on Instagram. We all send our Álvaro de Campos, proxies, emojis, memes, indirect expressions. Why? Because saying it directly is too frightening. Fear of rejection, fear of being hurt, fear of losing control. Pessoa did it 100 years ago, and you're doing it today. The difference is, Pessoa knew why he was doing it, and that knowledge didn't save him. 7 p.m. Café Martinho da Arcada. Pessoa sat in his usual spot, corner table by the marble, wooden chair, high back. The waiter approached, didn't ask his name, didn't take his order, just nodded. 5 minutes later, a small glass arrived, aguardent, Portuguese brandy, clear, strong, over 40% alcohol, made from grapes, but with no grape sweetness, distilled but not smooth, burned going down, set fire to the stomach. Pessoa lifted the glass, took a sip, breathed in, closed his eyes. The liquid slid down his throat, reached his stomach, heat spread, his lips warmed, his tongue tingled, his head lightened slightly. He took out a cigarette, struck a match, lit it, inhaled the smoke deeply, exhaled. Smoke rose to the ceiling, mingled with other café smoke, and ordered a second glass. Pessoa drank every day, not violently, not dramatically, not to the point of collapse, just steadily, quietly, 1 glass, 2 glasses, sometimes 3, enough to blur the edges, enough to quiet the voices, enough to dim the 70 people inside him. Why did he drink? To forget? To escape? To numb the pain? Or maybe to endure? To endure being 70 people inside one body, to endure the unbearable weight of multiple existences, to endure the loneliness of a man nobody understood. For 28 years, this was his rhythm. Office by day, cafe by evening, room by night, letters in English during work hours, poetry under other names after dark, and almost none of it published. Why didn't he publish? Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of mockery, fear of being ignored, but also fear of success. What if he became recognized? What if he became famous? Then Fernando Pessoa would become fixed, labeled, Portuguese poet, modernist, symbolist, categorized, trapped in an identity, unable to be anyone else anymore. Pessoa rejected categories. He was 70 people and simultaneously nobody. He refused any definition. Publishing meant being defined. Being defined meant being limited. Being limited meant death. So he didn't publish. But the real reason was deeper. Pessoa didn't want readers. No. More precisely, he didn't want readers of his present, not 1920s Lisbon readers, not Portuguese-speaking contemporaries, not people who couldn't understand him. He waited for future readers, readers 50 years later, 100 years later, readers born after his death, readers who would understand fragmented identity, readers who would accept multiplicity, readers who would understand the concept of heteronyms. So he put everything in the trunk, all manuscripts, all poems, all prose, all works by all heteronyms, inside the large wooden trunk with the domed lid, and waited until he died, until the trunk opened, in a future without himself, in a time with only his work remaining. He believed he would finally meet his real readers, but he also never finished anything. He started a poem, wrote 10 lines, stopped, started an essay, wrote 3 pages, started something else, conceived a play, created characters, wrote the first scene, put it in a drawer, planned a philosophical essay, made an outline, wrote an introduction, abandoned it. Almost nothing was completed, started things numbered in the hundreds, finished things numbered in the few, published even fewer. In his lifetime, Pessoa published only 1 book of Portuguese poetry, Mensagem, 1934. At age 46, 1 year before his death, the remaining 25,574 pages were all unfinished. Why? Not perfectionism. A perfectionist finishes things, just slowly, carefully, after hundreds of revisions, but eventually finishes. Pessoa feared completion. To complete meant to end, meant no more changes possible, meant closing off possibility, meant infinite potential becoming finite reality. Pessoa loved potential, everything that could be, every way it could be written, every truth that could be expressed. As long as a manuscript stayed in the drawer, it could be perfect. What wasn't yet written could become the greatest sentence. What wasn't yet solved could become perfect form. What wasn't yet expressed could become ultimate truth. But the moment it was completed, all those possibilities vanished. A completed poem was no longer a perfect poem. But this specific poem, it might be good or bad, but it could no longer be everything. Infinity became finite, potential became reality, dream became object. So Pessoa didn't finish, and he was right. In 1982, when the Book of Disquiet was first published, editors rearranged the manuscript, determined the order, interpreted it. In 1991, when another edition appeared, a different editor arranged it in a different order. 1998, another edition. 2010, another. The Book of Disquiet is still not finished, just as Pessoa wanted. It's still alive, still changing, still becoming everything it could be. Pessoa died in 1935, but his book is still being written. Incompletion was the most perfect completion. And what about your life? How many projects have you started, but not finished? How many dreams have you had but not executed? How many writings have you begun but not saved? We call you incomplete, a failure, a procrastinator, but Pessoa says not finishing can be a choice. not a failure, not ending can be courage, not weakness, because finishing kills the dream. Publishing limits possibility, ending means you can no longer become anything else. Of course, Pessoa said this drunk, but there's truth in drunken words, and that truth lives in the trunk, in 25,574 pages, forever unfinished, November 29, 1935. We're back where we started. São Luís Hospital, 3rd floor. Pessoa's body wasted by drink, liver hardening, abdomen swelling with fluid, skin turning yellow. By that point, he'd worked at 21 companies, written under 70 names, filled 25,574 pages, loved one woman, let her go, drank for 28 years, published almost nothing, and on the evening of November 29th, he asked for paper and pencil. I know not what tomorrow will bring. In English, the language of his childhood exile, the language where he first learned to become someone else. The next evening, he stopped breathing. His funeral attracted few people. He was unknown, just another office worker who died of alcoholism. The newspapers barely mentioned it, but his family opened the trunk, and 50 years later, the world opened that trunk too. The Book of Disquiet published, worldwide attention, his 100th birthday, bronze statue unveiled at Café Brasileira, tourists sit beside the poet for selfies. Present day, considered Portugal's greatest poet since Camões, one of the great modernists in any language, translated into 50 languages, the invisible man who lived 80 lives, became a posthumous god. But why does this matter to you? Why does a commercial correspondent who died 90 years ago in Lisbon matter to someone in New York or Los Angeles, or Austin in 2026? Because he was you. Pessoa was fragmented. You're fragmented. Pessoa lived multiple identities. You live multiple identities. You at work, you at home, you on Instagram, you on LinkedIn, you with parents, you with friends. They're all different. Pessoa couldn't be sure who his real self was. You can't be sure either. Which version of you is real? The one who posts motivational quotes, the one who doom scrolls at 3 a.m., the one who performs confidence in meetings, the one who cries in the shower. Pessoa proved something 100 years ago. Maybe none of them is real. And that's the point. Maybe authenticity isn't about being one consistent thing. Maybe it's about honestly acknowledging the fragmentation. Before social media taught us to curate multiple personas, before LinkedIn professionalism, and Instagram aesthetics, and TikTok performances, before we learned that identity is performed, not possessed, Pessoa knew. He created 70 heteronyms, not because he was confused, but because he understood something we're only now learning. You don't have to be one thing. Being multiple isn't a crisis, it's a feature. Your incompleteness isn't a bug, it's your most human quality. The difference between you and Pessoa, he turned it into art. You don't have to turn it into art, you just have to stop apologizing for it. Stop trying to be one consistent personal brand. Stop feeling guilty about your contradictions. Stop thinking you need to have it all figured out. Pessoa spent his entire life creating 70 people inside himself, and at the end, he was still writing. I know not what tomorrow will bring. He didn't know, you don't know, but today, you're here, multiple, fragmented, alive. In 1935, Pessoa put 25,574 pages in a trunk and died. In 1982, that trunk opened. In 2026, you're listening to this. He waited 100 years for his reader, for someone who would understand that it's okay to be 70 people, for someone living in a world where everyone performs multiple selves, for someone who needed permission to be incomplete. That reader is you. Right now, listening to this, you are the reader Pessoa waited for. The trunk is open. 1935. Pessoa died, but 70 writers lived, and they're speaking to you now. Fernando Pessoa failed, dropped out of university, lived in boarding houses his whole life, worked as a salaried correspondent, failed at love, published almost nothing, died of cirrhosis at 47. Small funeral, no obituary, but in the trunk 25,574 pages, 70 voices. A century later, translated into 50 languages, he proved something. The richest life may be the one nobody sees. He was invisible by day, but a galaxy by night. Nobody's at the office, but 70 people in his room. The world didn't know him, but he contained the world. What Pessoa did was one thing, he affirmed the multitude within himself. Caeiro, Reis, Campos, Soares. They weren't roles, they were truths, not masks, but faces, not lies, but deeper honesty. You're the same, already, your LinkedIn and your 3 a.m. self, your meeting room confidence, and your bathroom mirror doubt, your parent-pleasing version, and your friend authentic version. They're different, and Pessoa says that's normal. The difference is, Pessoa turned his into art. You don't need to turn yours into art, just accept it. You're not one, and that's enough. If after I die, people want to write my biography, there's nothing simpler. They only need to date the date of my birth and the date of my death. Between one and another, every day is mine. June 13, 1888 to November 30, 1935. 4 to 7 years between. Nobody can define them. Your life is the same. I know not what tomorrow will bring. Pessoa's last sentence. You don't know either, but today, you're here. Multiple, fragmented, living. Pessoa put these words in his trunk 100 years ago. Now they've reached you. If this story gave you something, a moment of permission, a way to see yourself differently, or just company in your own fragmentation, I'd be grateful if you'd share it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories about people who didn't fit, who lived multiple lives in one body, who proved that being broken open can be its own kind of wholeness. There are more trunks waiting to be opened, more invisible galaxies waiting to be seen. Thank you for listening. And remember, you don't know what tomorrow will bring, but today, you're here. Multiple, fragmented, alive. That's not a problem. That's Pessoa's gift.